March 14th, 2003. Springfield, Massachusetts. The demolition crew hit the wall at 9:47 a.m. Tony Rodriguez had been swinging a sledgehammer for 18 years. He knew the difference between breaking through plaster, brick, or wood. This was none of those. His hammer bounced off the interior wall of the old factory building with a metallic clang that rang through the empty structure. The hell? He stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the March cold. The building had stood at 447 Industrial Avenue since 1854. 3 stories of weathered brick, windows long since boarded up, roof sagging in places where water damage had rotted through the beams. The city had condemned it 2 years earlier. Now it was coming down to make room for a parking garage. Tony swung again. Same result. The hammer rebounded, the impact traveling up his arms. His foreman, Marcus Chen, climbed through debris to see what was causing the delay. Problem? There's something behind this wall. Tony tapped the plaster with his hammer handle. It sounded hollow, but the echo was wrong. Too contained. Marcus pressed his ear to the wall, knocked twice. Metal. Maybe an old safe? They spent 20 minutes carefully removing plaster. What emerged was a steel door, 3 feet high by 2 feet wide, set flush into the brick. No handle, no visible hinges, just a smooth surface oxidized to dark brown, with a keyhole that looked hand-forged. You think there's money in there? Tony's voice carried hope mixed with skepticism. Marcus photographed it with his phone. We call the city first. Protocol. The City Historical Society sent someone within 2 hours. Dr. Ellen Vasquez arrived with a crowbar, a camera, and unconcealed excitement. She was in her 50s, with gray hair pulled back severely and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. 1850s construction, she said, running gloved fingers over the door. Hand-forged steel. See these hammer marks? This wasn't factory-made. Someone built this specifically for this location. Can we open it? Marcus asked. Do we have permission to destroy it if we can't pick the lock? Buildings condemned. Everything inside is going to rubble anyway. Dr. Vasquez nodded. Then yes, but carefully. It took 40 minutes and 3 crowbars. The door finally gave with a shriek of protesting metal, hinges that hadn't moved in over 150 years finally surrendering. Inside was a space measuring roughly 4 feet deep, 3 feet wide, and inside that space, a metal strongbox. Tony reached for it. Dr. Vasquez stopped him with a raised hand. Gloves, and let me document first. She photographed the box from multiple angles. It was approximately 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep. More hand-forged steel, this time with visible rivets at the corners. A padlock hung from a hasp, but the lock had corroded through decades earlier. Dr. Vasquez carefully lifted the box. Heavy. She set it on the factory floor, brushed away dust, and snapped the degraded padlock with pliers. The lid opened. Inside, 47 technical drawings on yellowed paper. Each one showed detailed schematics of agricultural machinery, seeders, plows, harvesting equipment. The drawings were precise, professional, annotated with measurements and notes in careful handwriting. At the bottom of each drawing, initials. J.M. Also in the box, 16 letters, folded and tied with string that crumbled when touched. The paper was brittle, brown with age, but the ink remained legible. Dr. Vasquez unfolded the first letter carefully, read silently for a moment, then looked up at Tony and Marcus with an expression they couldn't quite read. This is signed, Samuel, property of Colonel William Mason, Virginia, 1843. Property? Tony frowned. He was enslaved. Dr. Vasquez's voice was quiet. And apparently, he was also an inventor. She unfolded another letter. This one dated 1847. The handwriting matched the technical drawings exactly. The same person who signed these letters drew those schematics, she said. But the patents... She pulled out her phone, began typing rapidly. J.M., those initials, James Miller. There are 7 agricultural patents registered to a James Miller in Massachusetts between 1848 and 1856. Marcus leaned closer. So Miller stole this Samuel's inventions? Or Dr. Vasquez pulled out more letters, scanning quickly. Or James Miller was Samuel. She found what she was looking for in the fifth letter. Read aloud. I have reached Boston safely under my new name. The blueprints survived the journey undamaged. Soon I will have the means to produce what they stole from me, and they will never know the man they called property has become their competitor. The factory went silent except for wind whistling through broken windows. Dr. Vasquez continued reading, voice barely above a whisper. Colonel Mason's business has declined sharply. His machines, which he claimed as his own inventions, cannot compete with the improved versions I now produce freely. He wrote demanding I sell him my designs, not knowing he was writing to the man who created them in his forge while wearing chains. I declined his offer. He died 3 months later, bankrupt. I attended his funeral, standing in the back where no one recognized me. That was closure. Tony broke the silence. He escaped slavery, stole back his own inventions, and destroyed the man who'd enslaved him. Economically, Dr. Vasquez corrected. He didn't kill anyone. He just outcompeted him. She was already photographing the letters, hands shaking slightly with excitement. This is extraordinary. We have documentation of an enslaved inventor who not only escaped, but actively undermined the system that enslaved him. And we have his actual technical drawings, proof of his genius. She carefully examined the technical schematics, comparing them to each other. These are sophisticated. See this cedar design? This is revolutionary for the 1840s. The mechanism for spacing seeds evenly would have increased planting efficiency by at least 30%. And this harvester, the blade angle here, the way the collection bin is positioned, this shows deep understanding of mechanical engineering and agricultural needs. Marcus picked up one of the drawings carefully. Why hide them here? Why not just keep them? Dr. Vasquez read more letters. He feared being discovered. Even in Massachusetts, fugitive slave laws meant he could be captured and returned. He was hiding evidence that James Miller of Massachusetts was actually Samuel, escaped property of Virginia. If these blueprints were found in his possession, if someone compared the handwriting to plantation records, she paused. He was protecting himself. This was insurance, proof of his original authorship if he was ever challenged, but hidden where no one would find it unless they demolished the building. Did anyone challenge him? Tony asked. Dr. Vasquez shook her head slowly. I don't know. I'll need to research. But the fact that these documents survived hidden for 150 years suggests... She trailed off, looking at the strongbox with something like reverence. He got away with it. She photographed every letter, every drawing. The Historical Society would need proper archival facilities, climate control, expert conservation. But first, she needed to understand what they'd found. The seventh letter, dated 1852, contained a list, 19 names. Next to each name, Massachusetts 1849, New York 1850, Pennsylvania 1851. What is this? Marcus pointed at the list. Dr. Vasquez studied it. I think these are other people. Look, next to each name there's a notation. Teaching reading, Lowell Mills. Blacksmith, Philadelphia. Seamstress, Rochester. She looked up. I think these are people he helped escape, people he educated, people he's keeping track of. The realization settled over them slowly. He didn't just escape and succeed, Tony said quietly. He built something. Dr. Vasquez nodded, still reading. A network. Look at this letter from 1850. Received correspondence from Marcus in Philadelphia. He has successfully established workshop and employed 3 from our former community. Elizabeth sends word from Rochester that her skills continue in demand. The system continues. What system? Marcus asked. Dr. Vasquez didn't answer immediately. She was reading the final letter, dated November 1858. When she finished, she set it down carefully and removed her glasses. What system? Marcus repeated. Systematic resistance, she said. He escaped. But he didn't stop there. He built a network of educated, skilled people who had been enslaved, taught them trades, helped them establish businesses, created an underground economy that competed directly with plantation owners. She gestured at the drawings. And he used his genius, the very genius they tried to steal, to bankrupt the man who'd enslaved him. She found one more item at the bottom of the strongbox, a small leather journal, water-damaged and fragile. Inside, written in the same careful hand, "If you are reading this, I am dead." These documents prove that James Miller, manufacturer of Springfield, Massachusetts, was born Samuel, property of Colonel William Mason, Virginia. I stole nothing. I reclaimed what was mine. Tell them I was never property. Tell them I was always free. They simply didn't know it. The demolition site had gone completely quiet. Dr. Vasquez closed the journal carefully, tears in her eyes. "We have to preserve this. All of it. This is..." She struggled for words. "This changes what we know about resistance, about genius in chains, about how freedom was actually achieved." Tony looked at the strongbox, the letters, the drawings. Who was he? Really? "I don't know yet," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "But I'm going to find out." She packed everything carefully, called for a university vehicle with proper archival containers. Before leaving, she photographed the wall cavity where the strongbox had been hidden, the factory building itself, even the demolition equipment. "This location needs to be documented," she explained. "This factory was built in 1854. Samuel, James Miller, must have constructed this hiding place himself. He owned this building. This was his manufactory." Marcus looked around the crumbling structure with new eyes. "This whole place was his?" "I think so. I'll need to verify ownership records, but..." Dr. Vasquez gestured at the building's bones. "This wasn't just a factory. This was a statement. A formerly enslaved man building an industrial manufactory in Massachusetts while his former master went bankrupt in Virginia." The university vehicle arrived. Dr. Vasquez loaded the strongbox and all its contents, insisting on personally accompanying them back to the archive. Before leaving, she turned to Tony and Marcus. "You just made one of the most significant historical discoveries in decades. This will rewrite what we know about enslaved inventors, about the Underground Railroad, about economic resistance to slavery." Tony watched the vehicle drive away, then looked at the empty cavity in the wall. "We found a ghost," he said quietly. "We found a genius," Marcus corrected. "We found someone who won." Later that night, after the news crews had left and the demolition was officially halted pending historical review, Marcus stood alone in the empty factory. The steel door hung open, the secret space exposed to light for the first time in 150 years. He thought about a man who'd built this place, who'd constructed machines that changed agriculture, who'd helped others escape and build new lives, who'd hidden proof of his genius where it would survive him, and who'd made absolutely certain his former master knew, before he died, that the man he'd called property had destroyed him. Marcus pulled out his phone and photographed the empty cavity one more time, because that empty space was the real story, not what was hidden there, but the fact that Samuel had needed to hide it at a Virginia, 1831, 14 years before the photograph. Samuel was 7 years old when he first understood what he was worth. Colonel William Mason stood in the plantation forge, examining the broken plow blade Samuel's father had just repaired. Behind him, a man Samuel didn't recognize wore a fine suit and carried a leather ledger. "This is quality work, William," the stranger said. "Your blacksmith is skilled." "Best in the county," Mason agreed. "Trained him myself." Samuel's father, Benjamin, kept his eyes down, hands clasped behind his back, waiting. The stranger walked closer, circling Benjamin like he was examining a horse. "I'll give you $800 for him." Samuel felt his mother's hand tighten on his shoulder. They were standing near the forge door, supposedly fetching water, actually listening. "Not for sale," Mason said. "I need him." "Then what about the boy?" The stranger pointed at Samuel. "He's young enough to train properly. Start him now. He'll be as valuable as his father by 20. Mason considered, looked at Samuel with the same expression he'd worn examining the plow blade, calculating value. "The boy stays," Mason finally decided. But you're right about one thing. Time to start training him. That afternoon, Samuel's childhood ended. His father put a 3-pound hammer in his hands and showed him how to strike hot iron. The work was brutal. The Virginia forge reached 2,500 degrees in summer. Samuel worked 10 hours a day in that heat, learning to read metal by color, to shape it with precision, to understand how temperature and timing transformed raw iron into tools. His father taught him everything, not just blacksmithing. How to observe without appearing to observe. How to listen when white people thought you weren't there. How to remember things you could never write down. You're not just a blacksmith, his father told him one night when they were alone. You're a man who happens to be enslaved. Never forget the difference. Samuel learned quickly. By 10, he could repair anything on the plantation. By 12, he was improving designs, making tools that lasted longer and worked better than what they'd replaced. That's when Colonel Mason started noticing. One afternoon in 1836, Mason brought a broken cotton gin to the forge. Piece of junk. Manufacturer's design is flawed. Teeth spacing is wrong, causes jams. Samuel's father examined it, nodded agreement. Can you fix it? Mason asked. Fix it, yes. Design it better. Benjamin hesitated. Mason's eyes narrowed. You think you can improve on a patented design? No, sir. Just repair what's here. But Samuel had already seen the problem. The tooth spacing wasn't the issue. The angle was wrong. If the teeth were angled 15 degrees instead of perpendicular, the cotton would flow through instead of catching. That night, Samuel sketched his solution in the dirt outside the forge, used a stick to draw precise mechanical diagrams he'd erased before morning, memorizing the design, understanding it, improving it in his mind. 3 weeks later, Mason brought another planter to see Benjamin's work. Best blacksmith in Virginia, he boasted, can fix anything. The visiting planter, Mr. Thornton, examined a harrow Samuel's father had repaired. This isn't just repaired. This is modified. See how the tines are positioned? That's a 30% efficiency improvement. Mason frowned. Benjamin, you changed the design? Samuel's father glanced at Samuel, then back at Mason. Yes, sir. Seemed like it would work better. It does work better. Thornton turned to Mason. I'll pay you $50 for one just like it. That night, after Thornton left, Mason came to the forge where Samuel was working alone. His father had been sent to repair a fence on the far property line. You did that design, Mason said. Not a question. Samuel kept hammering. Sir? The harrow. Your father's a good blacksmith, but he's not an inventor. That modification required understanding geometry and mechanical advantage. I've watched you work. You're the one who sees these things. Samuel set down his hammer, said nothing. Mason stepped closer. I'm not angry. I'm interested. Show me what else you've been thinking about. Over the next hour, Samuel drew designs in the dirt with his iron poker. A seed planter with better spacing mechanisms. A plow blade with a curved edge that would cut through Virginia clay more efficiently. A harvester modification that would reduce labor by half. Mason watched in silence. When Samuel finished, the colonel stared at the drawings for a long moment. You taught yourself this? Geometry? Mechanical principles? Watched things. Saw what worked and what didn't. Can you read? The question was dangerous. Slaves teaching themselves to read was illegal in Virginia. Samuel considered lying, decided Mason already knew the answer. Some, sir. How? Signs, labels on tools, pieces of newspaper used for wrapping. Mason nodded slowly. Tomorrow, I'm bringing you books, engineering texts, patent documents. You'll study them in your free time. Sunday afternoons, you'll have 2 hours in my library. Samuel's heart hammered. This was unprecedented, but he understood immediately what it meant. He wasn't being educated. He was being cultivated, like a crop. Yes, sir. And Samuel? Mason's voice hardened. Everything you design belongs to me. Everything you invent, I patent. You understand? Your mind belongs to this plantation same as your hands. Yes, sir. Mason left. Samuel stared at the dirt drawings, at his own genius rendered in ash and soot, and understood exactly what he was. Not a man, a tool that could build other tools. The books arrived the next day. Principles of Mechanical Engineering, Agricultural Machinery Design, Patent Law and Application, advanced texts that assumed years of formal education. Samuel devoured them during his 2 hours each Sunday. The library was small, attached to Mason's study. Samuel would sit on the floor, he wasn't permitted furniture, and read while Mason worked at his desk. Sometimes Mason would test him. Explain the principle of leverage. Samuel would explain precisely and completely, watching Mason's expression shift between satisfaction and something else. Discomfort, maybe, or resentment. Because every time Samuel demonstrated his intelligence, he proved something Mason's entire worldview depended on denying. That enslaved people weren't inferior. They were just deliberately kept ignorant. By 1840, Samuel had designed 17 innovations. Mason had patented 12 of them under his own name. The plantation's profits doubled. Other planters came from across Virginia to commission custom tools from Colonel Mason's forge. Everyone praised Mason's engineering genius. No one mentioned the enslaved blacksmith who did the actual designing. Samuel learned to live with this. Had to. There was no alternative. But he remembered everything. Every design stolen. Every dollar earned from his intellect while he received nothing but an extra portion of salt pork at Sunday dinner. He kept his own records, scratched notes on the back of broken tools, hidden in the forge's darkest corners, documenting his work, dating each design, marking his authorship in places Mason would never look. Evidence. For a future he couldn't yet see but refused to stop believing might exist. In 1843, everything changed. Mason announced he was expanding operations, building a new, larger forge. He needed someone to manage the construction and train new blacksmith apprentices. "You'll oversee it," he told Samuel. "You'll train 3 others, and you'll design new equipment for the expanded operation." It should have felt like opportunity. Instead, it felt like chains being reinforced. Because Samuel understood what Mason was doing, creating a system where his genius would multiply. 3 apprentices meant 3 more minds Mason could exploit. Expanded operations meant more patents, more profit, all flowing to Mason while Samuel remained property. That night, Samuel lay on the bare boards he slept on in the forge's storage room and stared at the ceiling. He was 31 years old. He'd spent 24 years creating innovations that enriched others while he owned nothing, not even his own thoughts. And if Mason's plan succeeded, he'd spend the rest of his life doing exactly that, teaching others to do the same, building a legacy of stolen genius. No, the decision didn't come as revelation. It came as simple, cold mathematics. The odds of successful escape were perhaps 1 in 50. The odds of dying in the attempt were high. But the certainty of spending his life as Mason's intellectual property was 100%. He'd take the 50-to-1 odds. Samuel began planning. Not impulsively, with the same methodical precision he applied to engineering designs. First, he needed documentation, proof of his authorship. He couldn't take Mason's original patents, but he could create his own records. Over the next year, he redrew every design he'd ever created, working by candlelight in the forge after everyone slept. He made technical blueprints on stolen paper, using ink he manufactured from soot and oil. 47 designs, each one dated with his original conception date. Each one signed with his father's name and his own, Benjamin and Samuel, property of Colonel William Mason. Proof that these innovations came from enslaved minds, not their master's genius. Second, he needed a destination. Pennsylvania was closest free territory, but everyone knew that. Slave catchers watched Pennsylvania borders. Massachusetts was further but safer, industrial. A man with blacksmith skills could disappear into factories and workshops. Third, he needed help. The Underground Railroad was real but secretive. One wrong word to the wrong person meant capture, torture, and likely death. He made contact carefully, through a free black porter who sold goods to the plantation, through coded conversations about packages that needed delivery north, through patient accumulation of information, safe houses, routes, signals. It took 2 years to prepare, 2 years of pretending nothing had changed while planning everything. In March 1847, the night came. Samuel waited until Mason traveled to Richmond for business, took only what he could carry, his blueprints in a waterproof case he'd sewn himself, his father's hammer, the only thing he had of family, a small pouch of money he'd accumulated through side repairs Mason never knew about. He walked away from the only home he'd ever known at midnight, heading north through Virginia forest, following instructions memorized from whispered conversations. The journey took 11 weeks, moving at night, hiding during day, following a network of safe houses operated by people who risked everything to help strangers escape. Samuel reached Massachusetts in early June, exhausted and 30 pounds lighter, but alive, and carrying proof of his genius. He took the name James Miller, common enough to disappear into, different enough to shed Samuel, property of Colonel William Mason, and he began building what Mason had tried to steal, not just his freedom, his Legac, Massachusetts, 1847-1854. Building an empire from stolen genius. James Miller rented a single room above a tobacco shop on Commercial Street in Springfield, 8 feet by 10 feet, one window, a mattress, a table, 2 chairs, and a coal stove that barely heated the space in winter. It cost him $3 monthly. He had $17 remaining from money he'd saved in Virginia. On his first morning as a free man, Samuel, now James, laid his blueprints on the table and assessed what he actually owned. 47 technical drawings, a blacksmith's hammer, the clothes on his back, and 16 years of engineering knowledge that had enriched Colonel Mason by an estimated $40,000. He needed capital. He needed equipment. He needed customers who would trust a black freeman with their business. The mathematics were brutal. A small forge required minimum $200 equipment, raw materials another $100. Rent for commercial space, $20 monthly. He had $17 and no credit, but he had something more valuable than money. He had innovations white manufacturers hadn't seen yet. James spent his first week walking Springfield's industrial district, studying every manufactory, workshop, and warehouse. He noted which businesses were thriving, which were struggling, what they produced, how they operated. He watched workers, observed production methods, identified inefficiencies. On day 8, he approached Daniel Cummings, owner of Cummings Agricultural Supply. Cummings was 45, heavyset, perpetually stressed. His storefront displayed plows, harrows, seed planters, all standard designs that competitors sold for identical prices. James walked in carrying one of his blueprints rolled under his arm. "Mr. Cummings, I'm James Miller. I'm a blacksmith with a design that could increase your seed planter sales by 40%. Cummings looked up from his ledger, saw James's skin, and his expression shifted to dismissive. "I'm not hiring. I'm not applying. I'm offering to license a patent." That got Cummings's attention. A black man talking about patents was unusual enough to overcome initial prejudice. "Show me." James unrolled the blueprint on Cummings's counter. It showed a seed planter with an improved spacing mechanism, adjustable tine positioning that allowed farmers to modify planting density without changing equipment. Cummings studied it silently for 3 minutes. His expression changed from skepticism to interest to calculation. "This work?" he asked. "I used this design on a Virginia plantation for 6 years. Increased planting efficiency 32%, measured over multiple growing seasons." "Why aren't you manufacturing it yourself?" "No capital, but I have 17 other designs equally valuable. I'll license this one to you exclusively. You manufacture and sell. I receive 10% of gross sales. No upfront payment required." Cummings leaned back, reassessing. "You'd trust a handshake agreement?" "I'd trust a written contract, which protects both of us." They negotiated for 2 hours. Final terms. James would license 3 designs to Cummings for 5 years. 8% of gross sales paid quarterly. Cummings would handle all manufacturing, marketing, and sales. James retained ownership and patent rights. James left with a contract and his first business partnership. No money yet, but a revenue stream that would start flowing once Cummings began production. He replicated this approach with 3 other manufacturers. Each time he offered designs they couldn't create themselves. Each time He structured deals that required no upfront capital, but guaranteed income once sales began. Within 3 months, James had licensing agreements with 4 Massachusetts manufacturers. Within 6 months, his quarterly payments totaled $43. By the end of 1848, he was earning $60 quarterly, enough to live on while reinvesting in his actual goal, building his own manufactory. In November 1848, James attended a bankruptcy auction for Watson Industrial Works, a failed machine shop on Industrial Avenue. The building was 3 stories of solid brick, built in 1839, with a functional forge, multiple workstations, and storage space. The opening bid was $400. James had saved $87. He bid anyway. The auction attracted 6 bidders, but 3 dropped out quickly. James stayed in, bidding against 2 established manufacturers who assumed a black man couldn't afford serious money. When bidding reached $300, James's remaining competitor looked at him skeptically. "You have that kind of capital?" "I have licensing agreements with 4 manufacturers generating $240 annually. Any bank can verify." That was a bluff. No bank would loan to a black freeman. But his competitor didn't know that. He assumed James had financial backing, which meant bidding higher was risky. At $380, the competitor dropped out. James won the auction with a bid he couldn't actually pay. He had 15 days to produce the money or lose his 10% deposit. James approached 5 banks. All refused. He approached 3 private investors. All refused. He approached Cummings and his other licensing partners. They were interested but wanted equity shares James wouldn't give up. On day 13, James did something desperate. He wrote to 6 southern newspapers advertising, "Engineering consultant available for agricultural improvement projects. Reasonable rates." 3 planters responded. One offered $60 for a custom harvester design. James produced it in 4 days, working 20 hours daily. He delivered the design, collected payment, and had $360. He borrowed the remaining 20 from Cummings against future licensing payments. On November 30th, 1848, James Miller became the owner of a 3-story industrial building in Springfield, Massachusetts. The real work began. James spent December 1848 renovating the forge. He couldn't afford to hire help, so he did everything himself. Repaired brickwork, rebuilt the furnace, constructed new workbenches, installed ventilation systems he'd designed but never been allowed to build in Virginia. He worked 18-hour days in freezing cold, stopping only to eat and sleep. His hands bled. His shoulders screamed. He lost 12 pounds he couldn't afford to lose. But by January 1st, 1849, Miller Manufacturing was operational. His first product was the seed planter he'd licensed to Cummings, but his own improved version. He deliberately held back his best innovations during licensing negotiations, keeping his most valuable improvements for his own production. The Miller planter, as he branded it, included features no competitor offered: fully adjustable row spacing, interchangeable tine sizes, a depth control mechanism that maintained consistent seed placement even on uneven ground. He manufactured 3 prototypes in January. In February, he brought them to the Massachusetts Agricultural Fair in Worcester. The fair attracted farmers and dealers from across New England. James set up a modest booth, displayed his planters, and demonstrated their features to anyone who stopped. On day 2, a farmer from Vermont tested the adjustment mechanism, saw how quickly it could be reconfigured, and asked the price. $18, James said. That was $3 above the standard planter price, but his modifications justified the premium. "I'll take 2. By the end of the 3-day fair, James had sold 8 planters and taken orders for 14 more. Total revenue, $396. Word spread. By March, dealers were approaching him directly. By April, he was manufacturing 20 units monthly. By June, he couldn't keep up with demand. He hired his first employee in July 1849. Marcus Washington, a freeman from Pennsylvania who'd worked in Philadelphia machine shops. James paid him fair wages, $10 weekly, which was equal to what white workers earned for equivalent skill. Marcus asked why James paid so well. "Because I remember what it feels like to create value and receive nothing," James answered. "That doesn't happen in my business." By December 1849, Miller Manufacturing employed 6 workers, all freemen, all paid fairly. all treated with the dignity James had been denied in Virginia. Revenue for 1849, $4,200. Profit, $890. James had gone from $17 to a profitable manufactory in 18 months. But money wasn't his goal. Revenue was just ammunition. In January 1850, James filed his first patent application. Not for the seed planter. He'd deliberately kept that unpatented to avoid legal challenges. But for an improved cotton gin design that solved the jamming problem Colonel Mason had complained about 8 years earlier. The patent was granted in March 1850, patent number 7043. Improvement in cotton gins. The patent holder of record, James Miller, Springfield, Massachusetts. The actual inventor, Samuel, formerly property of Colonel William Mason, Virginia. James manufactured the gin and sold it primarily to northern textile mills, but he also sold to southern dealers. Within months, his cotton gins were operating on plantations across the South, including, James discovered through careful investigation, Colonel Mason's plantation. In April 1851, Mason wrote to Miller Manufacturing requesting bulk pricing on cotton gins and seed planters. The letter praised the innovative design, noted these were superior to all previous models, and asked if Mr. Miller might be available for consulting work. James wrote back declining the consulting offer but approving the bulk order. 30 cotton gins, 15 seed planters. Total value, $1,040. He manufactured every unit personally, working alone in his forge late at night. He inspected each gin's mechanism, tested each planter's adjustment system, ensured everything functioned perfectly. Because he wanted Mason to know these machines worked, wanted him to use them daily, wanted him to praise their engineering to other planters. James never told Mason who designed them, never revealed that the innovative manufacturer was his former property, just took Mason's money, fulfilled the order professionally, and watched as his inventions spread across Virginia. By 1852, Miller Manufacturing was the second largest agricultural equipment manufacturer in Massachusetts. 12 employees, annual revenue exceeding $15,000, a reputation for quality that made the Miller brand trusted across New England and increasingly in the South. James expanded the building, adding a fourth story for storage and a second forge for increased production. He developed new products, an improved plow design, a mechanical thresher, a grain separator that processed wheat 40% faster than standard models. Each innovation drew from knowledge he'd accumulated in Virginia. Each product was something Mason could have manufactured if he'd recognized Samuel's genius as anything other than property to exploit. James documented everything meticulously. He kept ledgers showing every sale, every patent, every dollar earned. He saved correspondence from customers, including Mason's letters praising Miller products. Evidence. Not for legal purposes, no court would recognize his claim to designs created while enslaved, but for personal satisfaction. Proof that the genius Mason had tried to own had escaped, thrived, and was now selling superior products to the man who'd stolen from him. In September 1853, James received devastating news through a letter from a Virginia contact. Colonel Mason's plantation was struggling financially. Agricultural prices had declined, but more significantly, Mason's equipment sales had collapsed. Other planters had discovered Miller Manufacturing. Why buy from Mason when they could purchase superior equipment directly from the source? Mason's business, built on Samuel's genius, couldn't compete with Samuel's own business. In March 1854, Mason wrote again, this time requesting a meeting. He was traveling to Massachusetts on business and wanted to discuss potential partnership opportunities. James agreed to the meeting, curious to see Mason face to face as a free businessman rather than enslaved property. They met in James's office on April 12, 1854. Mason was 58, graying, looking worn in ways he hadn't 7 years earlier. He didn't recognize James. Why would he? He'd owned dozens of enslaved people. Samuel had been one competent blacksmith among many. Mr. Miller, Mason began, your designs are exceptional. I was an engineer myself before focusing on plantation management. I recognize sophisticated work when I see it. James nodded. Thank you. I'm interested in licensing some of your patents for Southern distribution. I have established dealer networks that could triple your market penetration. James let the silence stretch, watched Mason squirm slightly under his steady gaze. Your engineering background, James finally said. Where did you study? Largely self-taught, practical experience. I employed a skilled blacksmith for years who helped develop several agricultural innovations. Employed? Well, he was enslaved, but talented. I provided him with engineering texts, access to my library, treated him well. James stood, walked to his window overlooking the factory floor where 12 free workers operated equipment. This blacksmith, did you compensate him for his innovations? He received extra rations, but ultimately, anything created on my property belonged to my estate. That's law in Virginia. And when you patented his designs under your name, did you acknowledge his contributions? Mason stiffened. Who exactly are you, Mr. Miller? Someone who understands the difference between inspiration and theft. Your licensing proposal is declined. This meeting is finished. Mason left angry, confused, but still not comprehending who he'd just met. James never saw him again. In December 1859, Mason died. James learned this through a Virginia newspaper that arrived 3 weeks late. The obituary described Mason as a pioneering agricultural engineer whose innovations improved farming efficiency throughout the Commonwealth. James set down the newspaper and opened his strongbox. Inside, 47 blueprints, patent documents, business ledgers, correspondence from Mason praising Miller products. Financial records showing Mason's business decline corresponded exactly to Miller Manufacturing's growth. And one document James had written but never sent, a complete accounting of every design Mason had stolen, every dollar Mason had earned from Samuel's genius, every patent filed under Mason's name that Samuel had actually invented. James would never publish this accounting, never file lawsuits he couldn't win, never seek public recognition that society wouldn't grant. But he had won, quietly, methodically, completely. Mason died bankrupt, his reputation as an engineer intact, but his business destroyed by competition from a black freeman he'd once owned. And James Miller stood in his factory, surrounded by workers he paid fairly and equipment he'd designed freely, knowing that his genius, the genius Mason tried to steal, had not only survived, but flourished. The photograph taken in 1851 captured him at his forge, surrounded by tools he'd invented and blueprints he legally owned. Looking directly at the camera with eyes that held secrets no viewer would guess, that man wasn't property, had never been property, was always exactly what he appeared to be in that photograph. Free. Springfield, Massachusetts, 2003. What the letters revealed. Dr. Ellen Vasquez spent 3 weeks in the university archive before she found what she was looking for. The letters from Samuel's strongbox had mentioned 19 names, people he'd helped, people who'd escaped and established themselves in northern cities. But those names existed only in Samuel's private records, no official documentation, no census records under those identities, because they'd all changed their names, just as Samuel had become James Miller. But Ellen was methodical. She cross-referenced every detail, cities mentioned, professions, approximate dates of arrival. She searched property records, business licenses, church registries, looking for patterns that matched Samuel's network. On November 4, 2003, she found the first connection. Marcus Washington, listed in Philadelphia city directories from 1850-1878. Occupation, machinist. Business address, Washington Mechanical Works, established 1852. The name matched Samuel's letters. The timeline matched, the profession matched. Ellen pulled Philadelphia property records. In 1852, Marcus Washington had purchased a small workshop for $320. By 1860, his business employed 8 workers and held 2 patents for industrial equipment. She found his death certificate. March 1878, age 56. Cause of death, pneumonia. And in the estate records, she found something extraordinary. A bequest to the Miller Educational Fund in Springfield, Massachusetts. $200 designated specifically for supporting freed persons learning mechanical trades. The Miller Educational Fund. Ellen searched Springfield records and found it registered in 1855 under the management of James Miller, manufacturer. Samuel hadn't just escaped and succeeded. He'd created a network that supported others doing the same. Ellen found the second connection 3 days later. Elizabeth Morris, seamstress, Rochester, New York. Business established 1851. By 1857, Morris Tailoring employed 12 women, all listed in census records as free blacks or mulatto. Elizabeth had died in 1883. Her obituary, published in the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, described her as a pioneering businesswoman who employed and trained dozens of young women in respectable trades. The obituary included one intriguing line. Miss Morris often credited her success to education she received from an anonymous benefactor in her youth. Anonymous benefactor. Ellen knew exactly who that was. Over the next 2 months, Ellen traced 11 of the 19 names from Samuel's letters. Each one had established successful businesses in northern cities. Each one had employed other free blacks. Several had created educational programs or apprenticeship systems, and each one, Ellen discovered, had maintained correspondence with James Miller until his death. Which brought her to the next mystery. When exactly had James Miller died? The factory building had been constructed in 1854. Samuel's letters in the strongbox ended in 1858. But city records showed Miller Manufacturing operating until 1891. Ellen searched Springfield death certificates, found nothing under James Miller between 1858 and 1900. She tried a different approach: property transfers. The factory building had changed ownership in 1891, sold to Springfield Industrial Corporation for $12,000. The seller of record, the Miller Trust. Ellen found the trust documents in Springfield Probate Court. Established in 1866, the Miller Trust held all assets of Miller Manufacturing. Primary beneficiary, Marcus Washington, Philadelphia. Secondary beneficiaries, a list of 15 names, most matching Samuel's network. The trust had been administered by Springfield National Bank until 1891, when the final beneficiaries received their distributions and the factory was sold. But Ellen still couldn't find James Miller's death certificate. She expanded her search, checked Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, any state Samuel might have relocated to. Nothing. Then, on December 18, 2003, she tried searching under his birth name. Samuel. No last name listed in his letters from Virginia. Enslaved people often didn't use surnames. But property of Colonel William Mason. Ellen searched Virginia death records. Found Colonel William Mason, died December 1859. But no Samuel listed among his estate holdings at time of death. She tried another angle: manumission records. Sometimes slave owners freed enslaved people before death. Virginia required manumission to be formally recorded. Nothing under Samuel, but she found something else. In April 1861, a man named Samuel Freeman had purchased property in Richmond, Virginia, a small brick building described as previously used for blacksmith operations. Purchase price, $400. Samuel Freeman. Close enough to Samuel that it might be the same person. Close enough to James Miller's alias, James Freeman, would have been too obvious, to suggest connection. Ellen pulled Richmond property tax records. Samuel Freeman had paid taxes on that property through 1862. Then the property was sold in November 1862 to the Confederate Army for use as an armory. After that, Samuel Freeman disappeared from records entirely. Ellen sat in the archive, staring at documents spread across 3 tables, and tried to piece together a narrative that made sense. Samuel escapes Virginia in 1847, becomes James Miller, builds successful business by 1854, creates trust fund in 1866 that ensures his network receives support even after he's gone, then returns to Virginia in 1861, right at the start of the Civil War, using another alias. Why would he go back? The answer hit her as she reread one of Samuel's original letters, the one describing his escape. My father remains in Virginia. I could not persuade him to come with me. He is too old, he said, to start over, but I carry his teachings with me. His father, Benjamin. the blacksmith who'd taught Samuel everything. Ellen searched Virginia plantation records for Mason's estate, found an 1855 sale document listing enslaved persons and property after Mason's financial troubles forced him to sell assets. Among the names, Benjamin, age 63, blacksmith, sold to Richmond Iron Works for $550. Richmond Iron Works, the same city where Samuel Freeman purchased property in 1861. Ellen leaned back in her chair, seeing the full picture now. Samuel hadn't just disappeared from Northern records in the 1860s. He'd gone back to Virginia, in the chaos of Civil War, to find his father. Whether he succeeded, Ellen couldn't determine from available records. Richmond Iron Works had been destroyed during the war. Their employee and property records had burned with the building in 1865. But she found one more document that suggested an ending. In Springfield City Cemetery, there was a plot purchased in 1868 by the Miller Trust. 2 graves. The headstones had been weathered smooth, their inscriptions barely legible. Ellen visited the cemetery on a cold morning in January 2004, brought charcoal and paper to make rubbings of the worn stones. The first headstone, after careful rubbing and enhancement, revealed Benjamin, born 1792, died 1867, a free man. The second headstone, James Miller, born 1824, died 1867, inventor, entrepreneur, teacher. He was always free. We simply didn't know it. Benjamin had lived until 1867. Somehow, impossibly, Samuel had brought him north. Both had died the same year. Benjamin from age, he would have been 75. And Samuel. Ellen found the answer in a Springfield newspaper from March 1867. A brief article about a factory fire at Miller Manufacturing. 1 dead. James Miller, owner. The fire had been contained quickly, but Miller had died from smoke inhalation while evacuating his workers. He'd died saving the people who worked for him, people he'd paid fairly, treated with dignity, taught skilled trades, people who were free because he'd shown them that freedom could be built, not just granted. Ellen brought all her research to the university's history department in February 2004, presented her findings at a faculty seminar, Reconstructing Hidden Genius, the James Miller Network and Economic Resistance to Slavery. Her colleagues listened to evidence of a successful network of formerly enslaved entrepreneurs, of a man who'd built a business empire from stolen knowledge, reclaimed his genius, and used his success to elevate dozens of others. But why hide it? One colleague asked. Why didn't he publicize his story, become an abolitionist speaker like Frederick Douglass? Ellen had thought about this question. Because his network was still operating. Even after emancipation, the people he'd helped were vulnerable. Former slave catchers became police. Discrimination was everywhere. If it became public knowledge that successful black businessmen in northern cities had been connected to an escape network, they'd have been targeted. She clicked to her final slide, the photograph from 1851. James Miller at his forge, looking directly at the camera. This photograph tells you everything. He's standing in his own factory, surrounded by equipment he invented, but his expression shows no pride, no triumph. Just steady recognition that he's documenting something for posterity. He knew this story couldn't be told in his lifetime, but he made sure the evidence would survive. The blueprints in the strongbox, the letters documenting his network, the trust fund ensuring his beneficiaries were recorded. He was building a historical record that would prove, eventually, what white supremacy denied, that enslaved people were never inferior. They were deliberately kept from opportunity. The seminar room was silent. And he won, Ellen continued. Colonel Mason died bankrupt, his reputation intact, but his business destroyed. James Miller died wealthy, his reputation unknown, but his impact undeniable. 19 people he educated went on to establish businesses that employed hundreds of others. His network generated, conservatively estimated, over $300,000 in combined wealth across 3 decades. That's equivalent to roughly $10 million today. She paused. But more than money, he proved a principle. That genius can't be owned, that intelligence survives oppression, that the most powerful form of resistance isn't violence, it's building something they can't take away. Ellen's research was published in the Journal of African American History in 2005. The Miller Network, Economic Resistance and Hidden Entrepreneurship in Antebellum America. The article won 3 academic awards and sparked a wave of new research into formerly enslaved entrepreneurs whose success had been deliberately hidden or attributed to white benefactors. Museums requested loans of Samuel's blueprints for exhibitions on black inventors. The Smithsonian featured the 1851 photograph in a permanent exhibition on innovation and resistance. And in Springfield, Massachusetts, the old factory building at 447 Industrial Avenue was preserved instead of demolished. Converted into the Miller Center for Economic History, it opened in 2007 with permanent exhibitions on Samuel's life, his network, and the systematic theft of black intellectual property during slavery. The strong box itself sits in a climate-controlled case in the center's main gallery. Visitors can see the 47 blueprints, the letters, the business ledgers, can read Samuel's final journal entry about being always free, and they can understand something the historical record had tried to erase. That genius emerged even from the most brutal oppression. That intelligence couldn't be contained by chains. That people defined as property had, all along, possessed capabilities their enslavers depended on while denying. Ellen Vasquez stands in that gallery sometimes, watching visitors examine the blueprints and read the letters, watching them realize that American industrial innovation wasn't just white mechanical genius, it was also black brilliance stolen, hidden, and eventually reclaimed. On the wall behind the strongbox, projected large enough to dominate the room, is the 1851 photograph. James Miller, age 37, standing in his forge, looking directly at viewers across 150 years with eyes that knew exactly what he was documenting. A man who had never been property, who had always been free. We just needed 150 years to see it.